Hello, welcome Concordia University Irvine students. Welcome HLMG 425, Financial Management of Health Services Organizations. This is a week one overview. Of course, I am your instructor, Dr. Dale Gooden. Feel free to call me Dr. D. I don't think in the introduction I went over my credentials, but just so you know, I do have a Doctor of Health Sciences in Education from A.T. Stills University of Osteopathic Medicine. For those of you that are unfamiliar, A.T. Stills was the founding institution of osteopathic medicine and whole person healthcare. I am also finishing up an executive juris doctorate in health law, and I have a master, and that's from Concord University Law School at Purdue University Global. And then I have a master's of business administration with the concentration in health services management from the University of Laverne. So this is the week one overview. And I think maybe I'm going to experiment a little bit and we can talk in our virtual sessions to see how this is working out for you. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time going over the structure of the weekly content. I'm going to spend most of this time going over the reading. And so if that works for you, then we'll keep that format. So this week, of course, we're in the book Introduction to Financial Management of Healthcare Organizations. And that's the text that we'll be using for this particular course. And that is by Nowinski, published in 2017, and you can find all of the information there on page 5 of your syllabus. And I'm assuming that hopefully by now you have the book. If not, you could likely download it for free online if you haven't purchased it already. And in week one, we're going to go over chapters 1 and 2. And so for this session, I'm just really going to go over chapters 1 and 2. So the objectives for Chapter 1 is for you to understand the purpose of a healthcare organization, that you can relate that purpose to the management of the financial management of the organization. And you'll do that by understanding the objectives of financial management, the quality assessment applications of financial management, and also apply the ethics of your organization to financial management concepts. You're going to examine the value of healthcare finance as it relates to management functions in the changing healthcare environment. And we will review background information on accounting, economics, and statistics. And I think what you'll find is that with all of these business concepts, whether we're talking about finance, accounting, corporate strategy, economics, they all overlap with each other. And so we'll be using a lot of terms synonymous with each other, or a lot of terms that overlap with each other. And then some of your questions that you may have may not actually speak to finance at all. It may speak to accounting, or it may speak to strategy, or it may speak to economics. And so obviously for some of you, this is new information, similar to the way that clinical nomenclature is new to non-healthcare managers. So kind of flip it a little bit there with the financial concepts for non-financial managers. And so right there in the early chapters of your book in pages 4 and 5, it talks about the purpose of an organization. You know, once upon a time, before this thing called Sarbanes-Oxley and the whole financial ethics ethical issues of our country, one of the main purposes for an organization was to seek profit for the shareholders. But since that time here, over the last probably 15 years, that purpose of the organization, whether it be healthcare or not, has shifted more towards corporate and social responsibility with a heavy dose of ethics. So no longer is just the primary function of an organization to build profit for the shareholders. Now, organizations have a much broader purpose there as it relates to really being good citizens. And certainly, healthcare organizations have even a larger role to play within that, given the seriousness of the times that we're living in the post-COVID-19 environment here. So you've got organizations such as the Joint Commission and government organizations and government regulators that also help shape and form what organizations actually are in the modern environment. There are financial management associations, such as the ones discussed on Chapter 5, the Healthcare Financial Management Associations. And then we really start getting into some fundamental ideas. There are actually two parts of finance. There is accounting finance, and then there is financial management, and then there is managerial management. And so one is external looking. When we look at financial management, we look at things like balance statements, statements of cash flows, changes in owner's equity, all that internal information that is generated within organizations. When we publish that externally, that's considered financial management, because all of the work that we're doing is geared towards meeting external requirements. Whereas in managerial finance or managerial accounting, it is for the internal users. So we look at financial reports, and these are really proprietary financial informations from departments, divisions, and other internal metrics such as margins and cost structures that outside auditors or stakeholders from the outside aren't privy to. And so managers will use managerial information to manage the health and livelihood of the business. And then, depending on the type of organization that you are in, every quarter or every year, you have to publish these financial statements to your fellow stakeholders. So these would be the income statements, the balance sheets, the changes of owner equity, and the statement of cash flows. And we'll talk about all of those documents over the next 7 weeks. On page 7, you'll see a really cool exhibit on financial management concepts there, and you'll see the overlap between managerial accounting and financial accounting and how they overlap with each other. And you'll see how the other disciplines such as economics, statistics, research, I'll go ahead and add some like corporate strategy, brand management, they all intersect somehow with finance. So I'm saying all of that to say is that finance cannot be understood in a vacuum. A good way of really understanding it is on the hub and spokes model. So the hub itself would be the financial management, and then the different spokes that come out from the hub are almost like dependent variables that can change and shift depending on the financial health of the organization. And of course, there are all kinds of external regulators and external requirements as it relates to the financial health of your organization, particularly if you are a publicly held organization, meaning that your shares are available and sold on public exchanges, such as the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. And then even if you don't have any regulator, even if you don't have any mandates to publish your information to external regulators, still that internal accounting model that you use will look a lot like all the other accounting models and finance models, regardless of if you publish that information on a quarterly basis or an annual basis at all. As we kind of just move on here, I'd like to bring your attention to page 10, where we talk about quality assessment and healthcare finance. And if you think about it, part of what we do on the clinical side is we measure clinical outcomes, don't we? Outcomes from interventions, outcomes from care plans, outcomes from pharmacological regimens, if you will. But what this class does and what this course does is it ties that outcome to the financial repercussions of those outcomes, right? Because we know that in this environment, especially in the reimbursement environment, if you discharge a patient from the hospital and they are readmitted within 30 days for that same condition or similar condition, that has financial repercussions, doesn't it? Because you no longer qualify for reimbursement. Or if your patient presents within your healthcare institution and then they acquire hospital-based infections that they didn't have before they checked themselves or before they were admitted into the hospital, those have financial repercussions, don't they? Because those are diseases that you have to treat that are not reimbursable to a third-party source, right? And so if we kind of continue on with that same logic there, when clinical outcomes are missed or when clinical outcomes are compromised, there are serious financial implications. One of the big waves that we're seeing here in the United States are closures of hospitals, particularly small hospitals in rural areas. A lot of these hospitals are closing because of low reimbursements or because of overcharging and upcoding. And what happens when you overcharge or when you upcode, that means that you have billed your third party payer. In this case, we're really talking about the federal government, right? In Medicare, Medicaid, and some other types of services that they offer. When they come back and audit an institution and that institution has either coded something without clinical support or they have upcoded something without building the clinical case over time for the upcoding, CMS comes knocking on their door and they say, hey, we want our reimbursement back. And not only that, we want the reimbursement back with interest. And if you are unable to pay or if you are unable to prove your case, then you likely could be put on probation and no longer able to participate in Medicare or Medicaid programs. And so if you look at all of the closures of especially rural hospitals, but even small hospitals in small towns, about a third of them have closed because they no longer qualify for Medicare, Medicaid reimbursements as a result of mistakes in coding. And again, that all ties back to financial implications. So we're kind of moving on here. If you are not familiar with the seminal report from the Institute of Medicine, Call to Error is Human, it was published back in 1999, but it certainly still has a lot of ramifications for today. There's also the National Patient Safety Goals that are sponsored by the Joint Commission. So these are all external institutions, some of them sponsored by the government, some of them private, such as the Joint Commission, but they are geared to help you understand both the quality implications of clinical decisions, but more importantly, the financial implications of clinical decisions. One thing that I tell clinical managers all the time, especially nurses and doctors. I know that you joined this profession because you're a great person and you want to be able to help people. You know, maybe someone in your family suffered from a disease like cancer or congestive heart failure, and that motivated you to want to become a clinician. But guess what? We can only fulfill our passions as clinicians and as healthcare workers in institutions that are financially solvent and financially viable. And so we can't just get stuck looking at the clinical side and not understanding the financial ramifications that need to be considered and understood in order to keep your healthcare organization in business. So on page 15, we've got the values of healthcare financial management. We're looking at planning, organization, staffing, directing, and controlling. And those are the levers that financial managers can use in order to manage the financial health of the business. So let's put a pause here as we end our review of chapter 1. Because I've been using a lot of terms like financial managers, but in clinics, they aren't called financial managers, are they? They're called nurse managers. They're called supervisors. They're called C-level or C-suite executives. And so if you are a supervisor or a manager within a health services organization, you may not have the title of finance in your title, but you are responsible for staffing. And staffing and human resources is actually the largest financial commitment and outlay of the organization. You may be responsible for supplies and making sure that supplies are on hand for your department or for your division. Well, guess what? If you've got a bunch of supplies sitting on the shelf, then that's money sitting on the shelf that your organization could be using to pay bills or to promote cash flows. And so you have to determine what's the correct amount of inventory that you need to have on hand in order to support your division or your department, in contrast to having a lot of money tied up on the shelf that isn't available in circulation. And there are certain formulas, financial formulas that we'll talk about in this course that will help you figure things like that out. Some of you may already be familiar with Kaizen. It is a Japanese concept of just-in-time inventory. It was popularized back in the 80s and 90s with the large automotive company Toyota. And since then, that whole idea of just-in-time inventory has really transformed all industries, but not so much healthcare. And maybe that's because of just the nature of what we do in healthcare. So kind of in conclusion, organizations have multiple purposes, and the financial purpose of the organization is to provide accounting and financial information that helps healthcare managers accomplish organizational purposes. These objectives and purposes include to generate income, respond to external regulations, to facilitate relationships with third-party payers, and to influence the method and amounts of payments through monitoring physicians, through protected tax statuses, and then finally, understanding the impact of quality and profitability can turn good managers into great managers. I'm moving on to chapter 2, and in our overview with chapter 2, we're going to talk about some very important concepts that managers should understand, especially when we talk about what we call C-suite or C-level managers. These are the chief executive officers, the chief financial officer, the chief medical information officer, the chief nursing officer, if you will. We'll talk about identifying roles and responsibilities of these key financial managers and identifying any type of alternative structures for healthcare organizations. And so right there in the beginning of the chapter on page 32, we're looking at how, at least according to Dunn in 2016, these particular processes are differentiated into specializations, departmentalizations, defining the span of management, defining specific authority and responsibilities within the units and within the departments, and defining the nature of these relationships. And what you'll find is that there are a lot of overlaps when we look at the organization as a whole. If we just start at the organization level and just look internally, we're probably going to start with the board of directors. And the board of directors are the people that are responsible for looking out in the landscape of the external landscape, and then using that expertise to manage and set up the information for financial viability. And that financial viability is usually managed through an executive team or executive committee. And if you look on page 34, really good structure there in Exhibit 2.1 when it looks at the financial organizations. Notice here you've got the chief medical staff, you've got the chief executive officer, the chief executive officer, and then you've got this whole level of C-suite people under the chief operating officer. Now, of course, each organization is going to look different. Your organization probably looks a lot different from this org chart, but I want you to look at that org chart, and I want you to look at your org chart and see if you can match up some of these categories from page 32, see if you can match them up. I actually happen to work for a flat organization right now at Cardiovascular Centers, where we've got the CEO, and under the CEO, we've got my boss, who is both the chief operating officer and the chief medical information officer. Yeah, he is the chief operations officer and the chief medical officer. And then under him, you've got mid-level managers such as myself. So that organization is a lot what we call flat compared to what you're going to see here on page 34. But of course, you can best believe that in these large health systems, you've got large layers of organizational information, and each one of these roles and each one of these managers will have specific areas of responsibilities and specific controls that sometimes can overlap with each other, but often do not overlap with each other. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of information on chapter 2. I think it kind of speaks for itself there. So kind of in conclusion here with chapter 2, we're talking about how the governing body of healthcare organizations have several duties, such as the development and monitoring of the organization resources. The governing body also has a legal or fiduciary responsibility, meaning that if that responsibility is breached, there could be legal consequences to that. The CFO is ultimately responsible for the financial health of the entire organization. Now, notice here when we talk about the CFO is usually responsible for internal, but when we look at something like the controller looks external and they deal with external people within the outside of the organization. So often people ask, well, what's the difference between a CFO, or what's the difference between a vice president of finance and the controller? One is internal focus, the other is external focus. The COO is responsible for compliance. That's the chief compliance officer. The CIO, that's the chief information officer, responsible for processing telecommunications and computer systems. And there are other managers, mid-level managers, that are also responsible for different aspects of the organization. Whew, that was a long lecture, but I hope that you found it very helpful. This is week 1, so I do look forward to meeting with you on the virtual session. And then you can also look for either a follow-up video or a follow-up written lecture to this content. Please reach out to me with any questions, comments, or concerns, and I look forward to reading your week 1 assignments.